If we have COVID with us for the long term, how will you operate? How do you stage productions which have a chance of being in any way profitable?
Well, that is asking really almost the impossible, because I think it would be impossible. We know that theatre cannot operate with social distancing. I think if I can wind the clock back, as it were, back in early February, that was when I first heard that we could really be looking at a situation where theatres had to close. And as I had the production of a show I wrote, Phantom of the Opera, I'm not the producer of it, but I was in South Korea. We immediately looked at all of the measures that were being taken in South Korea to keep Phantom of the Opera open there to full houses, which, apart from 2 weeks where it had to close for various reasons, it has been able to do, and it's now ended its run there. And so we immediately commissioned, with Rebecca here, a full review of all of the measures that were taken, and therefore we were completely ahead of the curve, and we were really, really convinced that if we took one of our theatres, and we chose the London Palladium because it's in many ways the most difficult, that we could demonstrate that it was possible for theatres to reopen at full capacity safely. And to that end, we took the Secretary of State around the Palladium earlier in the year with the Officers of Public Health England, where I believe we did demonstrate this, which led to a pilot which we had hoped would be about demonstrating that the theatre could open at capacity. But in fact, it turned into a socially distanced pilot, which really rather proved that it was almost impossible on a number of levels for theatre to work in that way. We can obviously, and I can ask Rebecca, because she's probably more able to actually detail these measures than I am, but I am absolutely confident that the air, for example, in the London Palladium, and indeed in all my theatres, is purer than the air outside. The air handling, I think, is critical in all of this. And if I may say, it seems to me that the really important thing that needs to be done now is to be sending some of the money that is being spent on the arts to give it to theatres that may not be able to afford to do what we have been able to do, so that theatres can reopen safely. I mean, the answer is to your question, though, is that it would be impossible. The margins, say for a big musical, are very, very, very tight. I mean, if you were to take, say you were talking a really big musical, like say the Disney Frozen that's hopefully coming into Drury Lane next year. Say they were operating at £500,000 a week. The biggest slice of that, of course, goes in VAT. And I would reckon that Disney would be very lucky to make their investment back on that show for perhaps 2-3 years at least, and that's really at full capacity. The margins are incredibly tight.
If your question is about whether or not we're living with COVID for the long term, the challenge is looking on behalf of the workforce. This has been absolutely devastating and catastrophic for the theatre industry and for the live sector. Over 300,000 people are employed by theatre alone. You can more than double that when you actually look at what's going on for the live sector. And that doesn't even count all the ancillary services that support what we do. That's over 1 million people employed by this sector. That is huge. And that, of course, makes us uniquely vulnerable as a country in dealing with a pandemic, because the arts, performing arts, live theatre are not only one of our biggest assets and one of the strongest exports and things that bring in tourism. Over 34 million people come to this country every year, largely driven by the opportunity to see theatre. And if we don't actually do something to address that, and we don't find a means of actually being able to open theatres and venues again, then 1 million people will still be without work. It's been a very long time, and many of them have had no support. It's a really bad, catastrophic time, and we need to find a way out of it. We can't switch on theatre like a tap. You need 3, 4, 5 months planning minimum to even get shows staged. So my nervousness, and I know Andrew shares this, is that Christmas is very much hanging in the balance as we speak. And there's not very much by way of content that actually could be put back on this Christmas, even if we were to get the green light tomorrow. So we need that conditional reopening date as soon as possible to let us plan and reopen and get this part of the economy back up and running. In terms of cost, I think we spent over £100,000 putting that pilot on. We had some incredibly generous offers. Beverly Knight, who's a very good friend of ours, performed for free, which was amazing of her. But we would have lost an awful lot more money if people like her hadn't shown their generosity. The challenge with it was we learnt loads. So I have an incredibly professional and incredibly diligent team who are experts in the field. And I think that's what we were able to demonstrate in how we ran the pilot. But the challenge and the reality of it, and what it demonstrated, I think, to government and particularly to ourselves, is, as Andrew said, social distancing in theatre doesn't work. Having 30% capacity in an auditorium like the Palladium or any around the country does not work from a sheer economic point of view. And one of the challenges we had was the guidance that's been coming from government is incredibly detailed and incredibly prescriptive. And whilst we understand where some of that is coming from, that does mean it's incredibly labour intensive to actually get yourself into a position to host an event. And from a pure staffing point of view, ordinarily, if we're opening the Palladium for a gig, our staffing ratio would be 1 to 40. 1 to 40. And in this case, in the pilot, it was 1 to 10. So one staff member for every 10 members of the public. You don't have to be a huge and great mathematician to work out what that does to a very tight margin. Gigs alone, in the gig economy, you're probably looking at a 90% occupancy needed just to break even. And as Andrew said, that's before you even start looking at paying back investment, and particularly long-term investment that musicals need.
And one of the things which is very important with my theatres is that I believe very passionately that, I've been lucky in my career and that the theatres are a way of my putting back something into the profession that I love. And so every penny that we make in the theatres goes back into the buildings. At the moment, we're obviously in the throes of completing the big restoration of the Theatre of Drury Lane. But there comes a point now where we really can't go on much more. We're bumping up against our bank covenants and all of these things, because, as I say, theatre is a incredibly labour-intensive a business. In many ways, putting on a show now is almost a labour of love. Very, very few shows really, really hit the jackpot in the way that, say, a Hamilton or a Lion King or a Phantom of the Opera do. And it is absolutely imperative that people understand that you just cannot throw a theatre show up. It's not like a cinema. You can't just open the building. The people who really need help at the moment, I believe, are also the producers, because without the producers, we have no content. And at the moment, as Rebecca said, if this Operation Sleeping Beauty, I had to suggest that it wasn't going to be called Operation Cinderella, because my new show is Cinderella, and not a pantomime, I have to say. But, it would be possible to perhaps get that going if a green light were given now in a kind of scaled down way, because the producer of that has many of the pantomimes, just going around Britain anyway at Christmas time.
Yes.
So it's a little different. The pantomimes are a little different. But say something like the Phantom of the Opera, if we got the green light now, I would think it would just about might get on stage February, March next year, but not before. And a new musical, May, I have to take the decision about whether we go into rehearsal with my Cinderella or not. If I don't go into rehearsal, there is also the chance that it might open somewhere where people are being a little more helpful. Hygiene is vitally important, backstage. Absolutely. And testing. And that is what they've been able to do very effectively in Korea.
Absolutely. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are self-employed freelancers with no money coming in. And it would be absolutely devastating.
Well, I have an example of that. I'm sure the Musicians' Union will have something to say about this, but one of the finest viola players I know, who's played the Walton Concerto, I saw her the other day and I said, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm working in a supermarket." And I thought, well, really, this is beyond everything now. We just simply have got to get our arts sector back open and running. Britain is the leader in world theatre, in my view, in many, many ways. And we really, really got to use this opportunity to not only just to say that we want to get our sector open, but to demonstrate to the world how it can be open. It is, in my view, I think we are now at the point of no return, really.